What's going on, everyone? Tanner here, and spring is in full effect. We're in the mid 60s to lower 70s right now, which means I can finally get outside. That's right, I'm out here, I'm feeling good, I feel like myself again, no more seasonal affect disorder. And not only am I free, but they're free as well. They've been locked up all winter, just ready to roam free. But that's not what you came here for. Today is this kind of video. That's right, this one is going to be all about moss, more specifically collecting it. I got to get some for various projects that I'm working on right now, so I wanted to bring you guys along for the ride and show you some tips and tricks. Let's get right into it. When you're looking for moss, you often need to look no further than your own yard. We're in my garden right now, and as we were planting things the past weekend, I noticed that there was a lot of nice moss in here, so let me show you what we got. Down here are some of the mosses that I was telling you about, and we have a variety down here. I believe it's mostly star moss and thread moss. Now, before we get into that, I know that a lot of you guys are curious about how I identify my mosses, and that's something that we'll get through as we go further into the video. But in the meantime, this is some thread moss and star moss. So let's take a few patches here. So I'm just filling up this compartment of my trusty container here with mosses from my garden. But before we finalize that, I just wanted to show you this little scene here. I have it composed using the rule of thirds, but this is the kind of stuff that I reference whenever I'm doing my setups, and I just thought it was a really cool scene and wanted to share it with you guys. Now I'm underneath of my deck, and we have some really choice badge moss under here, but as you can see, somebody's already been taking it for themselves. I don't know who it was, but somebody's been doing it and they had the right idea. So we're gonna take some of it for ourselves because this stuff is really choice. Now I know that many of you are going to be able to find moss in your yard, but the best place to look really is out here in the woods. Now, to be honest, right now there's probably actually a better selection in my yard, and that's largely because we're pretty early in spring. There's not any foliage on the trees yet, so the forest floor and everything, it's drying up quicker than it typically would. So a lot of the mosses that are available here are dried out, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. Down here you can get a better look at what I was telling you about. As you can see, the moss is really dried up and it just peels up really easily. Now that's nice because we're not getting any of the dirt or other stuff that sticks to it. And since it's dried out, it's actually going to acclimate really well to your setup, because right now it's still kind of dormant. It thinks it's winter, or it's not sure quite yet what it wants to do. But when we put it in our setup, it's going to think, hey, it's spring, it's summer, and then it's just going to grow like mad. So it's actually not a bad thing to get a piece that's kind of dormant and dried out like this. We're about 20 feet from where we just were, and this is actually the perfect example of the opposite of what we just saw. This area is a little bit more shaded by the logs and everything here, and this is just like a rotten stump full of moisture, so it's actually going to retain moisture for the moss to feed off of, and it's thriving, whereas that other stuff looks like it's all dried out. And both are completely alive, it's just that this stuff kind of has a head start on the moss that you just saw. Now if you want to harvest moss that's growing on wood, it's best to actually take some of the wood that it's growing on, even if it's just a thin layer, because this is what the moss is accustomed to growing on. For whatever reason, it seems to like whenever you keep a portion of the wood with it, and then they can gradually work up to whatever type of setup you have them in. So if it's a substrate, if it's on another piece of wood, any sort of growing surface, they're going to acclimate to that quicker because they already are growing on what they're used to, and then they can kind of branch out from there, so to speak, or spread out to their new environment, and they should do quite well. Here's a location that has all of the right conditions year-round, meaning that the moss typically never goes dormant. It's always out and about, and in this location it's actually a lot wetter than some of the places we saw previously, so much so that it's almost like a bog. And in this spot there's a lot of liverwort and sphagnum moss. There's other types of mosses too, but predominantly sphagnum moss, and you're really not going to see that in other locations. It's typically in bog-like conditions or really wet areas. Now it will grow in terrariums and whatnot that are not quite as wet as this, but whenever you're looking for it out in the wild, you're only going to find it in spots like this. So I definitely came for some of this. If you're in a location that's plentiful with moss and there's also a lot of leaf litter around, it's worth moving the leaf litter to see if there's anything under it, because oftentimes you'll find some hidden gems underneath of there. As you can see, if I move all of these leaves, there's just a ton of liverwort underneath of here. Now, liverwort isn't a moss, but it grows in pretty much the same conditions, typically preferring areas like this where it's really moist. But I wanted to take some of this and talk about it in this video just because, like I said, it grows in similar conditions, and pretty much if you're going to be able to grow moss, you're going to be able to grow liverwort. About 10 feet from where we just were, there's a pretty substantial patch of mixed mosses. In here we have some Hypnum Moss and some star mosses, and this is a perfect place to show you about my moss code. What I like to do is whenever I take away from patches of moss like this, I'll only take what I need, maybe like a little section like this. I'm not going to take this entire sheet of moss and deplete it from the forest, because what if I want to come back to the same spot and I want this moss again, or if by chance somebody else is collecting moss back here. I highly doubt it, but if they were, they could take from this patch as well. Or even, I don't want to take away from the beauty of nature here. So I take what I need, and for example, if I were to take from the middle of the patch like this, I'll often sort of work it back in like that, and it's almost like nothing had ever happened. But I don't want this patch, so I'm gonna put it back and let it do its thing. I get a lot of comments from people who say that I should have brought a shovel with me or something like that. I guess they don't like getting dirt on their hands. Well, pro tip, keep your nails short. You're not going to get dirt under there, and you don't need to wear gloves. But that aside, whenever you're collecting moss, you don't need to be digging it up or anything like that. Just get your hand and kind of peel it up like that. Real simple. You don't need to be digging anything up. They're just attached to the surface of the ground and should peel up pretty easily. Here's another area that's pretty wet. We have some Hypnum Moss here, and it's growing on a rotten log, which of course is saturated with water. This again will be one where we have to take whatever it's growing on. It looks like a little bit of bark or even some of the rotten tree just attached there. And again, this is looking pretty good because it's in an area that's nice and wet. I definitely think that I collected enough mosses from back here for now. There's one thing that I want you to take away from this though before we get going, and that is whenever you're out in the woods looking for moss, find the areas of moisture for the best mosses. Of course, you're gonna see them everywhere, but if you find that stuff that's growing near areas that are already wet, those are what's gonna do best in your terrarium. They're gonna acclimate the quickest, and there will be less lag time, so to speak. Pretty much all mosses will work in terrariums long term, but those ones especially, there will be pretty much no acclimation. They'll just start growing like crazy. We're back in the animal room. I got the studio set up. We've got all of our spoils here. Before we open these up and take a look at the mosses, I just want to make a quick mention of the container itself. Obviously it's nice because it has a divider and I can separate the mosses based on type, but it's also nice because I don't actually have to use these right away. I'd say you've got about 2 or 3 days before you got to get the mosses out of here. Since they're sealed up, they're actually going to retain a lot of the water that's in the mosses themselves and keep them hydrated so they're not going to dry out. You can see on the side here there's a little bit of condensation, and that's a perfect sign of that. As I put the mosses out on this piece of coroplast here, I'm going to separate them based on type so that I can give you some pointers on how to identify whatever you have. And here we are, a beautiful spread of mosses. There's quite a variety here, and if you don't think that's something nice to look at, I don't know what is. I know early on in the video I said I was going to give you a lot of information on how to identify mosses for yourself. Now I kind of retract that statement because as I tried to film it for this video, I realized that I didn't want to just shove it into a short little segment because it's a really in-depth topic, so I'd rather save it for a dedicated video, so we'll do it at some point in the future. But anyways, let's look at the mosses that we've collected here. Let's start out on the right with some thread moss. Now this is a really common moss, and I say common because I'm sure you've seen it before. If you've ever been in an urban setting and you've seen moss growing in between cracks of the pavement, I'm almost guaranteed that it's this moss right here. I don't know what it is about this one as opposed to the others, but this one is always in settings like that. And the way that you could tell this moss apart from the others is that it's really fine. If you touch it, it almost feels like hair. And if you turn it to the side, it looks like individual strings or threads, as the common name implies. Pretty cool one. This one does really well in terrariums, and if you put it in there and let it grow for a few months, it's literally going to look like a patch of hairs. because it grows up about 1 inch tall or so, a bunch of little individual threads. It looks really cool. Onto these ones here, which may look a little odd right now. This is some star moss that has a bunch of sporophyte growing out of it. Now what sporophyte are, without getting into too much detail, is basically the moss's equivalent of a flower. They each have a bunch of moss spores in them. They'll get disrupted by the wind or what have you, and then the moss spores will get spread and moss will grow elsewhere. The way that you can identify star moss is that if you look at it, it looks like a bunch of individual stars growing close to the ground that stay relatively small. I'll show you moss here in a moment that looks really similar, but it grows much larger and taller, whereas like I said, this one stays low to the ground and is smaller. Pretty cool moss and does really well in terrariums. Onto the ones that I said look like star moss but are not, what we have here is some haircap moss. As you can see, it's a good bit taller and a decent amount larger than what you saw previously. There's also a brown sporophyte growing out of this one, so that could be an indicator as well. But these ones do fairly well in terrariums for the most part. I would say though that if you're looking at haircap moss, be sure that you're getting one like this that is completely green. If you get the ones that are about 2 inches tall and they're mostly brown the whole way up and then green on the top, they really don't do well in terrariums. You could definitely experiment with it if you wanted to. I haven't had success with them, but I usually do with these ones. This is a great accent as well because it can grow pretty tall, has some great texture to it, and definitely one of the ones that I like. Wait, let's back that up a little bit. I don't know what I was saying there. I like all mosses. Anyways, let's take a look at the Sphagnum Moss. This one is extremely easily identifiable. Obviously, it's much larger than the other ones, and it's also engorged with water. If you feel it, it's kind of springy, sponge-like. None of the other ones are quite like that. As you pull it out of the ground, it's usually not going to have much attached to it, if anything. And like I said earlier in the video, you're really only going to find it in extremely wet locations like a bog or something like that. So if you see this, I'm pretty sure you're going to know what it is. The same goes for the next one, which is some Fern Moss. I mean, if you look at that close up, it looks like a bunch of individual ferns. Obviously, none of the other ones have that characteristic, so you know right away this is some Fern Moss. This one is pretty cool, just obviously because of how it looks. It grows really well under variable conditions. And something interesting about this specimen in particular is that whenever we first harvested them, they were really dried out. But just from sitting in those containers with the other mosses for a day or two, they already picked up a lot of that moisture and they look much more alive than they did previously. Moving over again, we have some Hypnum Moss. Hypnum Moss is pretty easily identifiable for a few reasons. One is the color. As you can see, it's a much brighter green than all of these other ones here, almost like a chartreuse color, and it typically does look like that. Another reason is the way that it looks. If you look at it closely, it looks like a cotton string woven together. And although there are other mosses that look like that, this one especially has that characteristic, which is pretty cool. This one also has some sporophyte growing out of it, which look much different than the ones that we saw previously. I will say that this moss doesn't always do well in terrariums. I think that it has a hard time acclimating to new environments. That said, I have had some success with it in the past, and it's definitely worth trying because it's a pretty common moss. Over here we have another moss that's pretty easy to identify. If you look at it close up, it almost looks like a bunch of individual leaves growing on stems, but don't be confused, this is a moss, and this one is badge moss. It's not really too common, but it will grow really well in terrariums and it will add a lot of cool textures. So if you can get your hands on this one, I definitely recommend it because it's a great one and it always seems to do really well. Lastly, we have some liverwort. Like I said, this isn't a moss, but it shares a lot of the same characteristics. You're typically going to find it in the same locations, and it requires pretty much the same conditions to thrive. So I figured it was worth throwing it into this video. For the most part, these are easy to identify. There are some that look like the badge moss I showed earlier, so you may confuse the two, but for the most part, they look like this one here, almost like kelp or seaweed growing low to the ground. Occasionally, they can have a trident shape to them. This one here doesn't, but again, really easy plant to grow, works really well in terrariums, looks awesome, and is a great addition alongside these. Now that I've shown you all of the mosses I harvested, I gotta get them in a propagation bin here. But before I do that, I want to clean them off a little bit. And what I have here is just some dechlorinated water. Now I'll typically reference whatever type of water that I'm using, but dechlorinated is especially important for mosses because they're pretty sensitive to chlorine and chloramines. The reason that I like to clean my mosses is to get rid of any excess debris. It will also help hydrate them a little bit and get them ready for the life of a terrarium, but also to get rid of some pests. There will be some things that sort of hitchhike on here, and obviously dipping them in water isn't going to get rid of everything, but it will help against noticeable pests. And again, all that I'm doing is just dipping the mosses in the water, clearing them of debris, getting them nice and hydrated, and then I'm putting them in my propagation bin here, and I'm separating them by type of moss. Obviously they're pretty close together, but I'm going to be using them in no time, so there will be spots for it to grow and everything like that. I almost forgot to mention that if you want to learn more about this propagation method that I'm doing right here, check out the link up here. I have a whole video dedicated exclusively to this, so it'll give you an idea as to exactly what I'm doing here. I also do collect moss in that video, but I didn't go as in depth as I did in this video. But hopefully the combination of these two should give you a pretty good framework to start with. This gives you a good idea of everything that I cleaned out of the moss. Obviously a lot of it is just dirt, so it's discoloring the water, but there is a ton of debris in there that really, you just don't need it. If we want pristine moss, got to clean out all of this debris and it will grow perfectly. The last thing that I'll do is spray this down with some dechlorinated water. Again, dechlorinated water, and just getting it all good to go. And after a good spray down, we seal it up and it's ready to go. And that's going to do it for this one, Serpa Squad. I hope that you guys learned a thing or two that you can utilize while you're out in the field collecting moss. If you want to learn more about the propagation process that I showed in this video, I'll leave a link down in the video description on a video all about it, as well as my outdoor essentials videos. I got a lot of videos where I'm outside doing cool things like this, and I definitely think that they're a must watch. So if you're down there and you want to see some more content, definitely follow those links. Lastly, I thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed the video and haven't done so already, be sure to leave me a thumbs up, as it really helps me to continue creating content like this, and I look forward to seeing you guys all in the next one. Take care, and I'll see you next time. Peace.